African mythology is filled with powerful stories of magnificent cities, lost kingdoms, and sacred landscapes. From Swahili ports like Kilwa Kisiwani to stone palaces reclaimed by jungle, in this episode we follow those myths across rivers and lakes, through forests and deserts, and up into the sky realms where gods and ancestors once walked. In many African stories, rivers are not formed by rain or stone alone, but by divine acts or the work of spirits. In some traditions, the Nile does not simply rise from the earth. Its distant source is watched over by powerful beings in the highlands of East Africa, a region ancient writers once called the Mountains of the Moon. The geographer Ptolemy described these highlands as the Nile's hidden beginning, fed by lakes and clouded peaks so remote they seemed protected by the land itself. Over time, mystery hardened into story, and the river's origin became something guarded, not merely unknown. Among the Yoruba, there is a story about the early ordering of the world. Different powers gathered to decide how it would be arranged. Forests were claimed, farmland was divided, thunder and iron took their places. Oshun was present as well, listening, waiting, but her voice was set aside. She was told that care and restraint had no place in the work of shaping the world. Oshun did not argue. She turned away from the gathering and left. She walked until the voices behind her fell silent. When she reached the river, she entered the water and remained there, withdrawing from the world that had pushed her aside. After that, life continued, but it was no longer balanced. Crops still grew, but yields were poorer. Births became less frequent. Trade continued, but without prosperity. People began to treat the river with caution, even before they fully understood why. People did not understand what was missing at first. Over time, they connected the change to Oshun's absence, to the goddess who had walked into the water and did not look back. They returned to the riverbanks with offerings and promises, following tradition. Nothing changed immediately. Then, in the stories, Oshun began to give again. From then on, Oshun was understood as a presence who chose when to give and when to withhold. That understanding shaped how people approached her waters. Even now, people walk into the forest at the Osun Osogbo Sacred Grove, along the banks of the river Osun, speaking softly, as if the goddess who once left in silence might still be listening. Far to the south, where the Zambezi cuts a deep path through rock, people tell of a being Nyami Nyami who belongs to the river itself. He is often imagined as a vast serpent whose body moves through the depths of the gorge. In older stories, he and his wife lived close to the valley and its people, and the river behaved gently. Fish were plentiful. Floods came in their season and withdrew again. When the Great Wall of the Kariba Dam was built in the late 1950s, cutting the river in two, many said Nyami Nyami had been separated from his wife and from the valley he watched over. Floods damaged the construction. Equipment failed. Workers spoke of currents that moved against expectation. In the stories, these were not accidents. They were reminders that the river had not agreed. Across many African traditions, water is not an empty surface. It is depth, memory, judgment. Lakes are not merely places where villages settle nearby, but places where villages can vanish, leaving only water behind, calm and unbroken. Farther north, on the wide waters of Lake Victoria, fishermen speak quietly of what happens when arrogance meets open water. The lake can appear calm for hours, reflecting the sky so cleanly it feels harmless. Then the wind rises without warning, boats capsize, nets return empty. Those who ignore weather signs or sacred days are said to suddenly lose their luck. Lake Chad, shifting and uncertain even in memory, appears in story as something that breathes. Its shoreline advances and retreats, sometimes within a single lifetime. Reed Islands appear only when they are meant to be found. Along the long, dark reach of Lake Tanganyika, some communities speak of presences that live below the surface, guarding places shaped like courts. Elders warn that laughing at the lake, boasting about a good catch, or speaking carelessly near the water invites response. Storms arrive, nets bring up strange fish, and fortune grows thin without explanation. Among the Luo of Western Kenya, there is a small crater lake called Simbi Nyaima, often translated as the Sunken Village. The story begins with a celebration. A wealthy settlement turned away an old woman asking for shelter. She was mocked and sent away hungry into the dark. Only later was it understood what she was. When night fell, rain began and did not stop. By morning, the village was gone, and the crater was filled with water. Even now, the lake is described as strangely self-contained, with a sulfurous smell rising from its depths and the quiet sense that beneath the surface lie paths, homes, and ordinary lives held in place rather than scattered. In parts of Cameroon, crater lakes such as Nios are treated as beings. They can rise or sink, release their breath, or withdraw themselves from human use. Across southern Africa, stories tell of water beings who inhabit rivers, pools, and dams. Some who are drawn beneath the surface return after long absences, changed, carrying knowledge learned below. In Zimbabwe's eastern highlands, the Chinhoyi Caves' blue sleeping waters are said to house Nyuzu, mermaid-like spirits. Healers describe initiatory journeys into these underwater realms where some people return with powers and others never return at all. Taken together, these traditions do not describe water as chaotic. They describe it as settled. Craters become courts. Deep pools hold communities with their own laws. Life continues out of sight, intact, and waiting. Within the world just described, the story of Kofi unfolds. It is a fictional tale shaped by traditions that see rivers and lakes as living presences. It was one of the warmest summers he could remember. He was almost a teenager, already tall for his age, slender, handsome, and quick in his movements, with the easy balance of someone raised around canoes and shifting ground. Kofi lived with his people on the wide shore where red earth met dark water. His hair was worn in short braids, and a thin leather necklace with red and dark beads and a small blue charm rested against his chest. His sandals were simple hide and fiber, shaped to his feet. He moved with the confidence of a boy who knew his place among people and water, standing at the narrow crossing between childhood and what came next. The village was old, already standing when the elders' grandparents were young. It had learned its habits from the lake itself. Nets were set carefully. Voices were lowered near the water at dusk out of respect for the lake. When storms came, people said the lake had decided something, and no one argued. Kofi and his cousin Amari were sons of fishermen. From the time their hands were strong enough to pull a net, they were on the water. On days of rest, they paddled along the shore, swimming and leaping from rocks into deeper water. They already knew which waters were safe, which winds could be trusted, and which stretches of the lake were crossed only when there was a reason. Amari was 15, nearly a man in the eyes of the village, strong and steady in his ways. Most evenings, after the fishing was done, he and Kofi sat near the water and went over the day's catch, talking while their hands worked. They spoke about where the nets had been fuller, where the water had been difficult, and which places they meant to try another day. They spoke too of journeys beyond the village, the ones they would attempt when they were older. Amari always returned at the same time, when the last orange light slipped behind the far edge of the lake and evening settled over the shore. So when the sun lowered as it always had, Kofi waited without worry. He expected the canoe to appear, cutting across the darkening water as it always did. The light faded, the lake darkened, but Amari did not come back. It was in that season, when the dry months lingered longer than expected, that the canoe returned alone. It drifted in from the darker water just after dusk, moving slowly and turning once as it crossed the shallows, as if guided by a careful hand. A paddle rested across its rim, and a net lay coiled at the bottom. The lake nudged it gently toward the shore. Everyone recognized it at once. It was Amari's canoe, the one he had paddled since he was old enough to fish. They searched along the shore and through the reeds near the waterline, but found no tracks in the sand. The canoe was intact, the wood unmarked, the lashings still tight, with the paddle resting where it should have been, and nothing about it suggested damage or struggle. By afternoon, fires were lit and people gathered, and the elders spoke quietly together, not to explain what had happened, but because they had seen the lake return canoes this way before. That night, stories were told around the bonfire. People spoke of another village within the lake, with homes and gathering places that still existed, and of rules that had nothing to do with human ways and law. They spoke of boundaries crossed without malice, but not without consequence. In the days that followed, life continued. Nets were mended, fish were dried, and canoes went out and returned. Kofi fished the shallows as he always had, neither avoiding the lake nor approaching it carelessly. But he began to notice small changes. Fish appeared in his net on days when others returned nearly empty. Once, after pulling his canoe ashore, he found a line of small shells arranged neatly along the waterline, placed there as if by a patient hand. On another morning, he realized the sun had climbed far higher than he expected, though he felt he had only been on the water a short while. Again and again, his attention returned to the place where Amari's canoe had come back alone. One evening, as the air cooled and the surface of the lake smoothed into stillness, Kofi stayed out longer than he meant to. There was no fear in him, only a sense of waiting. When he finally turned back toward shore, the water beneath his canoe thickened. The lake slowed him without wind or current, and the sounds of the village faded, not suddenly, but as if distance itself had grown. The canoe tipped gently, and the lake received him. Light thinned gradually until blue turned green, then darker, like leaves seen through shade. The water closed around him, not crushing, but enclosing, as if the lake were drawing him inward rather than pulling him down. He moved through it, as if walking in a waking dream, his eyes adjusting to the dimness and shifting light. The village appeared before him, the one from the elders' stories. It did not feel lost or buried. It felt complete and alive. The huts stood as they were meant to stand there, their walls smooth with the slow work of water and time. Roofs curved inward in shapes that belonged to that place. Fish drifted through doorways and open spaces. Paths of pale sand and moving water ran between the huts, leading inward. Beyond the village, the land opened into a wide hollow, and from it rose the palace. It did not look built, it looked grown. Dark stone lifted itself into pillars that shone faintly, veined with lines of blue light that pulsed like breath. Roofs curved and overlapped like scales, shifting color as the water moved, so the whole structure seemed alive, adjusting itself to his presence. The gate stood open, unguarded. Two shapes carved from stone that was not quite stone watched without eyes, one like a woman, the other like a serpent. Between them, bubbles rose in endless threads, chiming softly as they passed, as if the lake itself were speaking under its breath. Inside, the palace opened wide. Pillars rose like tree trunks, and small silver fish clung to them in slow-moving patterns, rearranging themselves constantly, turning stone into something fluid. Above, the ceiling held the essence of the lake in a translucent swirl. Through it, the surface glowed faintly, distant and unreachable, like a second sky that no longer belonged to him. That was when the beings began to arrive. Some were almost human in form. From the waist up, they wore familiar shapes, faces and shoulders, hair drifting like river grass, their eyes reflecting light the way deep water does. Below, their bodies dissolved into shadow, or stretched into long, powerful forms that moved with the certainty of creatures that had forgotten what air was for. When they spoke, their voices spilled and echoed, carrying fragments of old songs bent by depth and time. Others were older, taller, thinner. They moved like reeds in a current, yet their shadows were heavy, dragging along the floor like crocodiles. Where their faces should have been, the surface of the lake shimmered, reflecting Kofi back at himself. The court formed without command. The beings stood in a circle around a slow-turning sphere of light and trapped air. A child who had slipped beneath a sudden wave stood near the pillars, still clutching a toy, already fluent in the language of currents. An old fisherman sat close to the circle, his hands translucent now, no longer steering boats, but the fogs and stillness that moved across the lake's surface. One of the beings glided forward and stopped before him, pointing toward the sphere. Others adjusted their positions at once without speech or signal and turned to face it, as if responding to a command. The sphere at the center of the court began to grow and shine, and within it the lake above became visible. Boats held back at the shore, storms moving across open water, passages closing where crossing had been possible before. No one spoke. Nothing was argued. This was not a place where reasons were given, only where results were decided. When the movement ended, he was sent back. Kofi was found at first light, lying at the edge of the lake where wet sand met dry ground. The lake had let him go, but it had not returned everything he carried. His sandals, his clothes, and the small necklace his grandparents had given him were gone. People wrapped him in cloth and carried him back to the village. When they asked where he had been, he shook his head and said very little. He did not speak of what lay within the lake, and no one pressed him to. After that, life in the village went on. Along the East African coast, white sandy beaches meet clear turquoise shallow water. Coral shelves lie just offshore, breaking the surface at low tide. Beyond them, the sea drops quickly into deep blue. The shoreline looks open and calm, but it runs along routes that ships have followed for centuries. Just off that coast lies Kilwa Kisiwani, a low coral island set in bright water and pale sand. Today it feels quiet, almost empty, but stone foundations rise just beyond the beach. Broken walls stand where palms now grow. In places, waves still reach the remains of buildings, reminders that this peaceful coastline once held one of the most important cities on the Indian Ocean. Kilwa began as a Swahili settlement around the 9th century. Its rise followed the arrival of the Shirazi ruler Ali bin al-Hassan, who transformed the island into an Islamic trading city tied into Indian Ocean commerce. Gold, ivory, and other goods passed through its harbor. For centuries, Kilwa's wealth rested on its control of trade routes that linked the African interior to Arabia, Persia, and India. The city was built largely from coral stone and lime mortar. Multi-story houses stood along narrow streets. Courtyards opened inward, sheltered from the heat. Public squares faced a busy harbor. Landmark buildings included the Great Mosque, expanded over generations, and the vast palace of Husuni Kubwa, with terraces, dozens of rooms, and a sea-facing pool overlooking the trade routes below. Its decline came later, beginning in the late 15th century as control of the gold trade weakened and Portuguese intervention disrupted the old networks. Trade shifted, power drained away. The city was gradually abandoned, leaving behind roofless mosques, fallen arches, and eroded palace walls, now partly overtaken by vegetation and tide. The founding myth speaks about a cloth. Kilwa began with the arrival of a ship. This story is a retelling of the traditional origin legend of Kilwa Kisiwani, the cloth that measured an island. The ship arrived with the morning tide, and from the shore it was clear at once that it was not local. Its hull sat deeper in the water than the fishing boats of the coast, broader and heavier, built for long crossings rather than short trips along the reef. The sail was large and pale, catching the sunlight as it moved, and the vessel carried itself with the steadiness of something long familiar with the open sea. When it grounded on the sand, the men aboard moved without hurry. Then a single figure stepped forward, and attention settled on him without anyone meaning it to. He wore fine silk garments that folded and shifted in the sea wind, their colors still rich after long travel. The cloth caught the light as he walked, marking him as someone from far beyond the coast. In later tellings, he was remembered as Ali ibn al-Hassan, a Persian prince from Shiraz, a city of gardens across the sea. Persia itself was spoken of as a distant place of silk and stone, known more by reputation than by detail. The prince stood for a moment on the beach, letting the wind move his clothes. He looked at the water, the reef, the narrow strip of land between sea and trees. Then he began to ask about the island, who lived there, how the tide shaped its edge. The king of the coast came to meet him, and people gathered along the shore to watch. Then the prince said that he wished to buy the island. The king laughed. The land was small, he said, coral and sand, shaped more by water than by men. It was good for fishing and for shelter and little else. But since the prince asked for it so directly, the king named a price, speaking aloud so all could hear. "Bring cloth big enough to wrap the whole island," he said. "Lay it along the shore all the way around. If the cloth meets itself again, the land is yours." The prince did not answer. He walked to the water's edge and followed the shoreline with his eyes, tracing its curves where the sea loosened and tightened its hold on the sand. When he had seen enough, he returned to his ship. For a time, nothing happened. Then the men came back carrying bundles. When they were opened, fine cloth spilled onto the shore, dark with dye and closely woven. Instead of laying it down whole, the cloth was cut into long, narrow strips. Piece by piece, the strips were joined and set along the water's edge, pressed flat against the sand, lifted over roots, guided where the shore bent inward and out again. The line kept moving. Voices fell away. Children stood watching as the thin bands of cloth followed the island patiently, bend by bend. At last the ends were brought together and tied. The line closed. The island stood measured by the terms the king himself had spoken. The prince said nothing. The cloth stirred in the wind. The water touched it and drew back. When the cloth was gathered and the shore lay bare again, the place looked much as it always had, but it was treated differently. Over time, coral was cut and shaped. Houses rose close together. Narrow streets formed. Ships began to stop more often. Some came because Kilwa Kisiwani sat where sea routes narrowed and inland paths met the coast. Ivory arrived slowly from forests far from the water. Gold dust followed, sealed in leather and clay, passing through many hands before moving on again. Years passed, counted by seasons of trade and changes in the shoreline. Stone replaced wood. Mosques rose above the water. The harbor deepened. Kilwa's name traveled farther than its outline ever had. From that morning on, Kilwa was no longer just a stretch of shore. It was a place that had been named, measured, and taken seriously. If Kilwa was a city born from a bargain spoken aloud, then Great Zimbabwe was a city built to endure without speaking at all. Great Zimbabwe was a stone city in the savanna of present-day Zimbabwe, active between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries. Its walls were built without mortar, enclosing hilltop and valley complexes that served both political and ritual purposes. For the Shona-speaking ancestors who ruled from here, the city was not simply administrative, it was a center of authority tied to cattle, trade, ancestors, and rain. Carved soapstone birds once stood high on walls and within important spaces at Great Zimbabwe. They were solid, stylized forms, some set on tall pedestals, others placed where they overlooked courtyards and enclosures. These figures are now known as the Zimbabwe birds. No written explanation survives. Their meaning was not recorded in text but carried through custom. The birds were not casual decoration. They appear to have been linked to authority and status, placed in restricted or significant areas rather than ordinary dwellings. Later traditions associate them with leadership, ancestry, and the relationship between rulers and the land. Kings were associated with rainmaking and communication with ancestral spirits, and later accounts link the site to Mwari, the high creator god approached through spirit mediums. When the city was abandoned and its roads faded into grass, the walls remained. Later visitors, unfamiliar with the traditions that built them, began to tell different stories. Colonial writers claimed the ruins could not be African in origin, attributing them instead to the Queen of Sheba or to biblical Ophir. These explanations were not based on evidence. The real builders were written out of their own city, replaced by a myth of outsiders. Local traditions did not vanish with the city. Accounts collected in the 19th and 20th centuries describe ceremonies held at the ruins, including sacrifices of black oxen conducted by spirit mediums to secure rain and protect crops. Elders spoke of voices heard among the stone walls and hills, as if the place still spoke when approached correctly. The ruins were not treated as empty. They were treated as occupied in a different way. Some local stories describe underground passages called Ninga, linking Great Zimbabwe to other sacred hills and caves. These routes were said to have been sealed by spirits after periods of disturbance and disrespect, closing access to places. Others tell of objects hidden in the hills, vessels associated with royal power, feared rather than sought, avoided because they carried consequence. What remains today is stone and grass. What remains in story is a city that did not simply collapse, but withdrew, a place where authority once flowed through ritual, cattle, and rain, and where absence itself became the source of legend. Mwari is the Shona creator and high god, also known as Musikavanhu, the maker of people, and Nyadenga, of the heavens. Mwari was not approached directly. Communication passed through spirit mediums and shrine systems across the Zimbabwe plateau. These intermediaries carried messages, offerings, and prayers on behalf of the living, maintaining a cycle of exchange between people, ancestors, and the divine. Oral accounts and later traditions link the stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe and the surrounding granite hills to the Mwari cult. The site is remembered as a major regional shrine where offerings were made and rain and fertility were sought. Its position high in the landscape, surrounded by hills, reinforced its role as a place where appeals to the heavens could be made. Rulers of Great Zimbabwe were judged not only by their control of people, but by their ability to maintain the relationship between the community and Mwari. Rain, crops, and stability were read as signs of approval. Drought and disorder signaled withdrawal. Spiritual and political authority were bound together. Shona traditions do not describe a crowded pantheon. Instead, they speak of a layered spiritual world with many forces operating under or alongside Mwari's authority. These spirits guard land, lineage, and memory. Each is tied to place, ancestry, and obligation. Mhandoro are powerful territorial and royal ancestor spirits, often associated with lions. They are linked to specific regions and dynasties and are believed to inhabit caves, forests, hills, and ancient stone. During times of crisis or ceremony, they may appear through chosen spirit mediums. Around Great Zimbabwe, Mhandoro are remembered as guardians of the land and its shrines, including the ruined city and the surrounding hills. Their presence binds royal authority to territory, enforcing continuity between past rulers, the living, and the ground itself. Shona traditions also speak of Dzivaguru, associated with great depth and pooled water. This figure appears as a primordial earth and water power, linked to sacred pools, underground springs, and cavernous spaces regarded as thresholds between worlds. These places are not empty. They are charged, feared, and approached with care. Local memory also speaks of a voice once heard within the ruins. Some identified it with Mwari himself. Others understood it as the voice of a powerful ancestral presence. Either way, the story reinforces the sense that Great Zimbabwe was a place where the boundary between human and divine could thin. Even in ruin, the city is remembered not as abandoned stone, but as a seat of sacred kingship and an enduring dialogue between people, land, ancestors, and the heavens. Great Zimbabwe was not the only city to retreat without being destroyed. Far to the west, in dense forest and open plains shaped by rivers, another city rose on a very different principle. Where Great Zimbabwe built upward in stone, this city expanded outward in earth. Where one enclosed power, the other stretched it across distance. This was Benin City. Benin City was the heart of the Edo Kingdom, a place of power and ceremony long before outsiders wrote about it. From around the 13th century onward, it grew into a carefully ordered capital, known for its royal court, its art, and a city plan shaped by authority rather than chance. The land around it was shaped just as deliberately. Vast earthen walls and deep ditches ran across the countryside, enclosing neighborhoods, farmland, and ritual ground. These earthworks were not only defenses, they marked how space was claimed, governed, and given meaning, laying out the relationship between ruler, people, and the sacred. Unlike many ancient cities, Benin was never swallowed by forest and forgotten. Even after the British attack of 1897, when the city was burned, looted, and its bronzes carried away, Benin did not vanish. It was rebuilt. Kingship survived in altered form. The city remained a living center rather than a ruin. Benin City stands inside a dense web of Edo myth where creation, kingship, and the gods are inseparable from the life of the city. Imagine a king so important that people said he carried a spark of the gods. In old Benin, that was the Oba, descended from Osanobua, the creator. He wasn't just a ruler, he was a bridge between heaven and earth. Every year, during big festivals, the Oba's job was to refresh the world, making sure the kingdom stayed in balance, the land fertile, the people protected, and the ancestors pleased. In Benin, power was spoken of through gods with names, roles, and demands. At the highest level stood Osanobua, also known as Osa or Osanobua. Osanobua is the Edo creator god, remembered in myth as shaping the world and sending his children down from heaven to arrange it. In these stories, the royal line of Benin descends from this divine origin. The Oba was therefore not only a ruler of people, but a figure whose authority reached upward as well as outward. Alongside Osanobua was Olokun, the powerful deity of the sea, wealth, and fertility. Olokun ruled the deep waters, the source of riches, children, and abundance. Edo tradition speaks of a balance between the two realms, the Oba as king of dry land, Olokun as king of the waters. Court ritual treated them as counterparts, whose harmony sustained the health and prosperity of the kingdom. Other gods shaped the city's daily life more directly. Ogun, the god of iron, warfare, and metalwork, was bound to blacksmiths, warriors, and the tools through which power was enforced and expanded. Edo creation stories describe a world that was once covered in water until Osanobua's children descended and brought forth land, order, and the conditions for human life. Other narratives connect the founding of the Benin monarchy to the figure of Oranmiyan, blending remembered history with divine descent. In these stories, kingship emerges not from conquest alone, but from alignment with forces older than the city itself. Benin City wasn't just run by a king. The Oba was believed to have a second self somewhere out of sight, tied to the gods. What happened in the city depended on keeping that connection intact. Rituals, festivals, and shrine visits weren't side traditions. They were how the place stayed in order. Gods, ancestors, and rulers were all part of the same system, and if one side slipped, the whole thing felt it. Benin endured because that structure was believed to hold. Hidden cities across Africa do not always announce their endings. Some are left intact. Others are covered gently by forest or grass. Their disappearance is not always a collapse, but a choice shaped by shifting power, changing trade, or altered relationships with land and ancestry. Far south on the Highveld, another stone city followed a different path into disappearance. Archaeologists use the name Kweneng for a large Tswana stone-walled settlement occupied for centuries and abandoned roughly 200 years ago. On the ground, the site is easy to miss. Thornbush, scattered stones, open grassland, nothing that announces a city. Only from the air did its scale become clear. Aerial photography and LiDAR surveys revealed thousands of homesteads, cattle enclosures, and roads spread across the plain. Kweneng had not been buried or destroyed. It had been absorbed into ordinary land. As a Tswana settlement, its layout reflected social order expressed through cattle, ancestors, and household space. Stone walls marked status and lineage. Cattle kraals formed the center of domestic and political life. When the settlement was abandoned, there was no dramatic collapse. The city simply stopped being maintained, and the grass closed over it. Kweneng's story is not preserved through rich oral legend. Its significance lies elsewhere. It shows how a city can vanish without secrecy, without jungle or sand, and still be completely forgotten. A capital can disappear in full daylight, leaving no myth behind until someone looks from above. Some mountains enter myth as the seats of gods, as the Nile's hidden beginning, or as distant ranges imagined to hold up the sky. In Anansi stories, Nyame's sky palace is the high, distant home of the sky god, where the stories of the world are kept like a jealously guarded treasure. It is usually imagined as a grand house or court in the heavens, far above human villages, reached only by climbing, magic, or a special path, and ruled by Nyame with the dignity of a king who owns all wisdom and tales. Travelers moving toward Mount Kilimanjaro see it long before they reach it, On clear days, it rises suddenly from the surrounding land, its white crown floating above heat and dust like something misplaced. The lower slopes are warm and green, fed by rain and streams, while the summit remains cold and distant, capped with ice that seems impossible under an equatorial sun. That contrast alone unsettles expectation. Snow where none should exist. Cold above heat. Silence above sound. The Chaga regard the snow-covered summit of Kilimanjaro as the holy dwelling of Rua, a creator deity whose realm is above the inhabited slopes, shrouded in cloud and distance. Local traditions describe the mountain not as an object to be climbed, but as a presence that touches the sky. Some stories speak of spirits dwelling near the summit, others of ancestors who retreated upward, closer to the heavens, where human no longer threaded. Further north, rising sharply from central highlands, Mount Kenya occupies a similar place in story, though its shape and mood are different. Its peaks are jagged, broken, carved by ice and time. Rivers flow outward from it in all directions, feeding land far beyond its slopes. Because of this, it has long been treated as a source rather than a destination, a place from which life descends rather than one to be entered. Among the Kikuyu and neighboring peoples, Mount Kenya is associated with Ngai the Creator, whose dwelling is said to lie near the summit. Houses were traditionally built facing the mountain, not to admire it but to acknowledge it. Prayers were directed toward it. Important acts were performed with its presence in mind. The mountain did not demand temples or walls. It demanded orientation. Far to the northwest, where Africa leans toward the Mediterranean, the Atlas Mountains stretch across Morocco and beyond, forming a long, uneven barrier between coast and desert. Unlike solitary peaks, the Atlas is not a single summit that dominates the imagination. It is a system of stone and weather that shapes movement across the region. Passes open and close with seasons. In some Amazigh traditions, mountains are tied to spirits and ancestral presence, places where human order thins and older forces linger. In many African traditions, people say there is a height so great or a sky so deep that it no longer belongs fully to the human world. This idea is often called the cosmic mountain, not a single mountain on a map, but the idea of height itself as a center. A place where the roots of the world sink downward and its summit disappears upward, passing through human land and into something older and less defined. In stories, it is imagined as a pillar that holds the sky in place, a route along which creation moves, laws descend, and prayers climb until the air grows thin and strange enough to change them. In Africa, this idea rarely stays abstract. People point to real mountains, plateaus, cliffs, and even trees and say quietly that this is where the distance between earth and sky becomes smaller. These places are not always climbed. Often they are simply faced, oriented toward, allowed to stand as they are, doing their work without interference. Around Mount Kilimanjaro, communities have long spoken of the ice-capped peak as a dwelling place for spirits and guardians tied to rain, fertility, and the boundary between the living and what lies beyond sight. The mountain rises abruptly from warm land, its lower slopes green and familiar, its summit cold and distant, holding snow where none should exist. That contrast alone marks it as a vertical road, a place where offerings and prayers are said to rise upward with clouds and return as weather, water, and change. Further north, in Ethiopia, high plateaus and mountains serve a similar role. Monasteries cling to cliffs and flat-topped peaks, reachable only by narrow paths that discourage casual approach. Pilgrims speak of these places as points of nearness to divine presence, where the rock itself feels like an altar and the sky presses closer to the ground. To build there is not to dominate the height, but to accept its terms, to live where weather, isolation, and silence constantly remind people that they are not in control. Across many regions, enormous trees and earthen mounds take on the role of cosmic height. Baobabs, fig trees, and other long-lived giants are treated as meeting points between worlds. Offerings are laid at their roots. Rituals unfold beneath their crowns. The trunk stands between soil and sky, and the branches are sometimes described as an upper village, a resting place for ancestors or powerful beings who no longer live fully among the living. In these places, height is not measured in distance, but in age and presence. In many African cosmologies, people say the Creator once lived very close to humans, walking among them or resting just above their dwellings. Something happened, a mistake, an offense, an accident. After that, the divine withdrew upward. The true dwelling of creation moved into the layered sky, becoming harder to reach, reachable now only through dreams, trance, ritual, or places that stand in for the cosmic mountain without leaving the land. Among the Kikuyu of Kenya, this idea becomes very specific in the stories told about Mount Kenya, which they call Kirinyaga. Kirinyaga rises sharply from the surrounding land, its peaks jagged and broken, its upper slopes wrapped in mist and snow, even when the fields below are hot and green. Ngai, also known as Mwenenyaga, the possessor of dazzling light, is understood to dwell on or above these heights, not confined there, but oriented to it. A presence that can be addressed by facing the mountain, by aligning the body and the prayer with that distant, shining place. Villages traditionally wake facing Kirinyaga. Doors, shrines, and sacred fig trees are placed so that when people stand before them, their bodies line up with the mountain on the horizon. Prayers for rain, for children, for safe journeys are spoken with eyes turned toward that direction, as if addressing a house partly hidden by cloud. No one claims to live on the very top, where air thins and weather changes without warning. Instead, people meet Ngai partway. They walk on certain days to groves or great fig trees on the lower slopes, places remembered as Ngai's footprints on earth. Milk or beer is poured out, names are spoken, ancestors and children are called into memory so that the one who dwells above will remember in return. Sometimes people say, as those prayers rise, the summit's light grows strange, clouds gather tightly around the peak, thunder rolls through stone and air. Elders point and say that Ngai is walking, that the sound is his movement across the stony crest, and that lightning is the edge of his glance cutting through the sky. In one remembered season of long drought, fields cracked and rivers shrank. The people went to such a grove with what little they had left. By evening, a collar of cloud wrapped the highest peak, and overnight soft rain fell across the land. After that, children were taught to read the moods of the mountain, sharp and blue, hidden, crowned with cloud, veiled with rain, each a sign of how near or far the sky feels. Across all these places, the pattern holds. Mountains, heights, and vertical landmarks are not conquered. They are listened to. They are treated as living thresholds, places where power does not reside in walls or weapons, but in distance, orientation, and restraint. Beyond the mountains and open sky, the Sahara begins. Here, stories move slowly, carried by memory and repetition. In a land where little endures, myths gather around spirits that test the living, wells that become settlements, and oases that appear once and vanish like mirages. One of the greatest examples of Mirage City is Zerzura. One early description of Zerzura appears in a 15th century Arabic manuscript known as the Kitab al-Kanuz, the Book of Hidden Treasures. It describes a city west of the Nile, white as a dove, whose gates bear the carving of a bird with a key in its beak. The instruction is to take the key, open the gate, and enter. Later travelers repeated the tale with their own details. They spoke of a path through barren mountains, a dry wadi that winds between two peaks until it turns toward the setting sun. The desert there grows strangely pale, the sand fine and cold beneath the feet. A few hardy shrubs mark the way, and then, if fortune allows, the wind breaks and the valley opens to reveal the gleam of white stone where no settlement should exist. That, they say, is the road to Zerzura. At the center of the city rose a castle of pale stone. There, a king and queen were said to lie asleep amid vast treasures, gold, jewels, and ancient tools of unknown make. The old stories gave a warning: take what you wish, but never touch the sleepers. Something unseen guarded them, a force that punished whoever tried to wake them. The people of Zerzura, called El Suri in some accounts, were described as fair-skinned and kind to outsiders, yet they spoke a dialect unfamiliar to the travelers who found them. They lived apart from the desert tribes and the world beyond. Some tales also tell of guardians who watch the city's borders, giants, creatures with wings, or spirits bound to protect the place from harm. In modern retellings, Zerzura has become the Mirage City, the city of pure white stone, seen once and lost, half believed and half remembered. Whether it was ever a real oasis or only a traveler's deception in the heat, we do not know. Tuareg traditions speak of the Kel Esuf, literally the people of solitude, spirits linked to Esuf, the wild spaces beyond camp, and the loneliness that comes with them. Travelers encounter them in remote dunes, rocky hollows, and other empty places, close enough to trouble travelers who pass through without care. In stories, they can cause illness, confusion, or unsettling trials, especially for those who find themselves alone or out of balance with the world around them. Kel Esuf grow jealous of people who are fortunate or undergoing important life changes, and they may attack by causing sickness or mental distress. Some Tuareg even become friends of the Kel Esuf, entering into a pact with these spirits, often after a period of serious illness or possession, and by following strict rules and making offerings, turn dangerous contact into a source of healing and divination for others. The Kel Esuf have their own language, families, and ways of life, reproducing and competing with one another much like humans. Not all desert spirits walk the open dunes. Some wait where the living leave their dead. Tuareg storytellers tell of the Idebnis, spirits that haunt lonely graveyards and stone tombs. In one tale, a married woman, desperate for word of her husband away on caravan, dresses in her finest clothes and lies down on a stone grave for the night. An Idebni rises from the tomb in the shape of a young man and questions her. If she keeps her composure and gains his favor, he tells her whether her husband still lives and where he travels. If she falters, the spirit tightens its hands around her throat, and she never leaves the graveyard alive. Among the Tuareg, one name holds unusual weight: Tin Hinan. She is remembered not for conquering land or building cities, but for knowing the desert well enough to lead her people through it and keep them alive. The stories place her journey deep in the Sahara, moving south from the north with a small following of people and animals. Her path ends in the Hagar Mountains, where stone rises from sand and roots naturally converge. The land there offers just enough shelter to pause and just enough water to remain. In Tuareg memory, this is where lineages begin. Not because a city demanded it, but because knowledge made return possible. Camps formed and dissolved, paths repeated, and children grew up learning which stars guided safe travel and which valleys to avoid in the heat. There is no great city tied to her name, no walls or towers to mark it. Instead, there is her tomb in the Hagar, which serves as both ending and beginning. It anchors memory to the land, not as proof, but as a sign that a life can bind people to a place. The care in her burial and the objects laid beside her speak quietly of regard and lineage. suggesting she was not a legend invented later, but someone whose presence shaped those who followed in her footsteps. The Tuareg are known across the Sahara for their caravan routes, their control of wells and crossings, and the indigo veils worn by their men. Their stories come from life on the move, from camps set beyond towns, from long stretches between water, and from what is believed to exist outside the circle of the campfire. Not far from where Tinhinan's story settles into the sand, another kind of beginning appears. It does not open with a conquering king or caravan of gold, but with a woman at a well. Along the old desert routes, traders speak of Buktu, a Tuareg woman who kept a water place on the southern edge of the Sahara. She guarded the wells and watched over the belongings of travelers who passed between the deep desert and the grasslands beyond. Her camp stood where movement slowed and people began to stop rather than hurry through. Over time, the habit of pausing became a settlement, and the place took her name, Timbuktu, the Well of Buktu. Not every desert story fades into legend. Some are covered over, sealed by sand, and left to wait. In the eastern reaches of the Sahara, the remains of Timgad lie beneath layers of sand that once rose high enough to hide entire streets. When the city was first uncovered, its grid appeared almost intact. Stone, roads, columns, and foundations preserved not by care, but by burial. Wind and sand had done what fire and siege did not. They closed the city gently and kept it still. Timgad was not hidden by intention. It was simply abandoned as routes shifted and priorities changed, and the desert did the rest. Over time, dunes rolled in, pressing against walls, filling rooms, smoothing edges. What disappeared was not erased. It was sealed. When uncovered, the city did not look ruined so much as paused, as if waiting beneath a lid of sand. In a remote part of the central Sahara, the ruins of the Jado Plateau tell a harsher version of the same story. Stone towns cling to rocky outcrops where water once collected and caravans once passed. Buildings collapsed as roofs failed. Walls fractured under heat and cold. But even here, sand filled the gaps, settling into doorways and courtyards, softening the outlines of daily life until only shells remained. Yet for those who encounter these places later, the effect is unsettling. A city found whole beneath sand feels deliberate, even when it was not. Streets without footprints invite stories. Walls without voices suggest secrecy. A well becomes a city of gold. A buried street becomes a forbidden kingdom. The desert and its sparkle like golden dust seems to encourage these stories. That is how Mirage becomes legend. That is how sand turns ordinary places into hidden cities.